Our studio. Lindsay, you're standing by with a guest?
Yes, I am, Deirdre. I'm standing here with the third highest ranking Republican in the House. He's the chairman of the House Republican Conference, Congressman Adam Putnam. Thank you so much for your time.
Sure.
Be honest here. What kind of relief are you feeling right now that there was passage of this bill?
Well, I think this was the right vote for the country, the right vote for this economy. Obviously, we've seen a big shift in the votes since Monday. Largely, I think, because there's a greater awareness of just how serious an economic situation we're in. Constituents at home are beginning to understand that better than perhaps they did on Monday, as we've seen credit markets continue to impact small businesses, students, people seeking home mortgages. And so that, more than anything else, I think, moved the votes.
We heard Nancy Pelosi, the House Speaker, speaking in very conciliatory tones, very different than what we heard on Monday. Did that make a big difference, do you think, for voters, or did they come, for lawmakers rather, or did they come to the floor today knowing that this thing was going to pass?
Well, I think there was a higher level of confidence that the votes were there when we came to the floor today. Obviously, you heard a lot of bipartisanship from the leaders on both sides, and I think that's a much more constructive approach than perhaps what we heard on Monday.
A lot of talk about the eye toward the future, about how there's going to be a lot more accountability. We know there's going to be a ton of hearings, particularly in Henry Waxman's committee, the House Oversight Committee. What are lawmakers going to be looking to find out from Wall Street in terms of the origins of this crisis?
Well, I think we need to look in our own backyard as part of that search. You know, we want our constituents are angry at how this happened. They want some assurance that it's not going to happen again. Our regulatory structure is not kept up with these new sophisticated financial instruments like credit default swaps that have come about in the last several years. Fannie and Freddie should never have been allowed to operate in the regulatory limbo that they have for decades. We want to find out if there were fraudulent or deceptive or illegal activities going on inside these companies as we move forward. What we did today was an important recovery plan, I think, to help slow the bleeding. We're still in for some rough times with this economy, but from an institutional standpoint, from a long-term standpoint, we do need to bring more reforms into this system.
When you talk about reforms, are you talking about greater regulation, greater oversight over Wall Street? And if so, what specifically do you think you could see on the horizon?
Well, I think that, you know, the government involvement in Fannie and Freddie should be temporary. I think that we should begin to shrink the size of those two entities. We need to decide which parts ought to remain public and which parts ought to be completely spun out as private entities. I think that hybrid approach did not serve the American taxpayer well. I think we ought to take a hard look at some of these instruments, that these slicing and dicing of mortgage-backed securities, and what the proper role and regulation for those should be. Secretary Paulson, to his credit, at the beginning of this year laid out a long-term blueprint for modernizing the regulation of the financial infrastructure in this country. I think that serves as a great first draft for Congress to take up.
Let me ask you to go back to Monday for a minute here. That was a day when Republicans decided they did not want to vote for this bill. It was a big surprise, particularly to the markets. The markets proceeded to tank 777 points. Was that from your party that a sense of responsibility, maybe even a little bit of guilt about what had happened?
Well, you know, I think that some members who may have voted against it at that time came to understand just exactly what we're facing. But I said then, and I will continue to say, the Dow is not the best barometer for us to measure the worthiness of this bill. We're trying to unlock the credit markets. The Dow is going to move up and down based on a variety of factors, not just what happens here in Congress. The purpose of this legislation is to get some liquidity into those credit markets and free up small businesses, get banks lending to one another again, and get this economy lubricated again. The Dow does what it does for a variety of reasons, and that should not be the end-all, be-all for public policy.
You probably heard about the jobs number today, a loss of 159,000 jobs in the last month, recession more and more being bandied about as being the norm for this economy at the moment. What do you think needs to be done? Do you think this legislation will do enough to jumpstart the economy?
I do believe that this legislation provides an important infusion of capital into those credit markets. The 150,000 job losses are tragic, and our heart goes out to those families who are now trying to struggle in this economy. The purpose of this legislation, though, is to prevent something worse than a typical cyclical downturn. In other words, something worse than a recession, and that's what all the indicators were showing themselves to be, which is that we were standing on the precipice of something much different much more severe than a typical recession.
All right. Well, Congressman Adam Putnam, chairman of the House Republican Conference, we thank you for joining us here on Bloomberg. We'll send it back to you in New York. Deirdre.
Lindsay, thanks very much.